talking about cross-border compliance strategies for the EU AI Act and its relevance to medical devices. So when you're looking at a medical device that includes AI, you're having to actually consider two completely separate regulatory regimes. The new EU AI Act, which Tom will talk about a little bit later, and also the EU medical device regulations. So compliance becomes tricky because it's in these two strands. We'll talk about that first. Tom's going to talk about then the implementation timeline, and we'll have a look at some obligations for high-risk developers. So that's the sort of overall agenda of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. So in terms of AI regulation for medical devices, as we all probably know in the UK, the UK approach has been basically quite a pro-innovation approach to AI, whereas the EU has basically taken a much more prescriptive approach to AI regulation, and that causes its own, I think the two areas cause concerns for different reasons, but as I said, certainly in the UK and certainly in relation to medical devices, the MHRA has done lots of consultations and we haven't quite got to a clear position on what's happening with AI medical devices here in the UK at the moment. We are still, even with some of the amendments that have been made in some of the new regulations in force, we're still basically on the medical device regulations, which is the sort of early 2000 directives in terms of medical devices. So we're not consistent with the EU MDR. And it seems from MHRA's approach, we're looking at very much more sort of making the UK consistent more with FDA approach to medical devices rather than perhaps the EU approach. But if you're a medical device manufacturer, you've got to try and be consistent with both, which can be a little bit of an issue. So moving on to obligations under the EU AI Act. One of the things that obviously is incredibly important, particularly with medical devices, is having this additional protection for the fundamental rights of things like patients that are having their data processed by AI systems. And we've got a talk this afternoon on data protection in AI, so I won't go into very much detail on that at the moment. Again, also very much a consideration of the AI-specific risks, like bias. I think Zhang talked about having data sets and the amount of data sets you have. What are your data sets of? And have those data sets just by the factor of the types of patients, for example, you have in your clinic, how does that potentially affect any bias in an AI system, both in the training database, but also in the testing databases? And that comes straight on to the having accurate and relevant training of the systems. And again, as talked about, really important that post having a product available, that continual training and checking of your systems. Human oversight is something that is incredibly important within AI, and that's something that needs to be built into the systems under the EU AI Act so that we don't have AI systems, and particularly medical devices, that are completely free from human oversight, but we are certainly moving into areas with med devices where diagnostics are coming in, particularly in areas like, and I think Tom's got some examples later, things like dermatology diagnosis. And what's also very important within the EU AI Act is this automatic generation of event logs. So making sure that as your AI system is working, it's very clear what is happening, what it's doing at any time, so that information can be looked at afterwards to see what has been going on with your AI system. So you have this wonderful AI device, this wonderful medical device, a bit of software. What do you have to do in terms of getting it on the market? And one of the things that is required both in the EU and here is a notified body assessment. So this is a third-party, independent assessment. You've probably heard of people like BSI, British Standards Institute. Those are the sort of people that basically provide conformity assessments. The difficulty that you have if you're an AI medical device developer in Europe is that you have to basically have a combined conformity assessment. So your notified body has to be able to check your medical device both for compliance with MDR and also for compliance with the EU AI Act. I did a little bit of, well, literally this afternoon, I thought I'll have a look on the aptly named, well, I don't know what the app is called, the NANDO database, which is the list of European notified bodies for ones that are compliant with the EU AI Act. Now, it is early days in terms of implementation, but there's a big fat zero. So, you know, this can cause a bit of a problem, I think. And I mean, it's a similar problem that we had when we left Europe. And suddenly, overnight, we had, I think initially after Brexit, 2 or 3 notified bodies in the UK. There's a lot more now. But, you know, this is going to be a problem for people and for device manufacturers. There is a sort of workaround that I think we talk about a little bit later. But, you know, realistically, you're going to want a single body. Now, I think the big companies like BSI will basically get themselves to be able to do conformity assessments under the AI Act as well as under the EU MDR. So I think this will be, it's not going to be a complete absence, but I think it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of competition in the market. And considering what, for example, Henry talked about earlier with, you know, there's a lot of money going into AI in medtech, and rightly so. But I think you've got to think about how those regulatory hurdles are going to be jumped. And I think, as I said here, there could be potential delays in designations, literally due to what we had at Brexit, a sort of backing up of delays in those assessments. So in terms of next steps, and there's an awful lot of sort of commentary on this, we're going to need some harmonised standards for the providers of high-risk AI systems. So something that someone can say, right, okay, I have reached this particular standard, an ISO standard or whatever it is, and therefore, by having that standard, I can basically show that I reach the standards required for a notified body assessment. Conformity assessments can fill those gaps in the interim. But I think it's very important for developers to be looking now at assessing their compliance with the EU AI Act obligations. And as I said, I think Tom is going to go into that in a lot more detail. And also, importantly, check to see whether the notified body that you're working with is going to be or intends to become designated under the EU AI Act. Because if they don't, or they're not going to be, you probably want to start speaking to somebody else. Because, as I said, the timelines for these sorts of things can be quite long. And you want to make sure that you're already engaged with somebody who knows that, right, okay, we're going to have our clinical investigations, you know, package ready for you by X time. Can we book a slot in almost to get our notified body assessment? So those are the next steps in terms of that sort of the med device and combination. And I think I'm turning over to Tom now. I'm going to just
so this is really when we're looking at all of these obligations starting to count. So the European Parliamentary Research Service has introduced an at-a-glance timeline. So I've pulled from that. So the AI Act was published in August 2024, but not all of it was enforced straight away. So they've estimated that it'll be about 3 years before we really get everything and all of the obligations in force. So we've firstly got, on the 2nd of February this year, some chapters on general provisions. So that's the requirement that staff within an AI developer or anyone deploying AI should have AI literacy. So that's the first part of that chapter. And then just some prohibited practices. There's also an annex listing some of those prohibited practices and guidance on how to spot them. From August this year, these parts have begun to bite. So that's parts on notified bodies, general purpose AI models, AI governance, penalties, also confidentiality. So next year, on August 2nd, that's when the full Act begins to apply, other than the Article 6 high risk classification rules and obligations that go along with that apply, which is incredibly important for this talk because that's where most medical devices lie. There we go. That's the end date when we all need to really care about this. Okay, so as Lisa's mentioned, almost all medical devices require a conformity assessment. And so because of that, most medical devices will be categorized as high risk. So for the definition of high risk systems, an AI system needs to be a safety component of a medical device or the actual medical device itself, and require a conformity assessment under what's called union harmonization legislation. And that includes the medical devices regulations as well. There's also an Annex 3 to the EU AI Act, which contains systems that are automatically classed as high risk, irrespective of use. And that captures things like the AI systems that analyze biometric data or serve kind of public health or law enforcement purposes. So, as I say, from the 2nd of August, it's important to identify what categorization these devices will fall into. Because, as I say, providers of high-risk systems are under significantly higher obligations and stricter disclosure requirements than other AI tools. So, as I say, incredibly important to firstly identify whether the tool is going to be considered as a high-risk AI system or not. It's also very important to determine what kind of entity you are. Are you developing the tool and placing it onto the market, in which case you're a provider, and therefore you have different obligations to if you're kind of contracting in a third-party solution, in which case you're a deployer. And so then you have different obligations. So it's about identifying the tool and then who you are. And then once you've done that, you can kind of build a framework of obligations that you will need to comply with. I'll just pass back to Lisa briefly about the categorization of medical devices.
If a medical device requires a conformity assessment under the MDR, it will be deemed high risk under the EU AI Act. I think this is, the MDR brought in slightly different classifications, and I think we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later, but most software used to be class 1, which is lovely self-certification. These days, the majority of software that is a medical device is going to be classified as class 2A, which means, at least, which means that you're going to need a conformity assessment, and that therefore means that you're going to be considered to be high risk under the EU AI Act. And I think there's something, and not surprisingly, we do an awful lot of advice to people in this area to consider, is your AI system actually a medical device? Or can you say, oh, well, it's simply it just gives my clinician some information and then they make the final decision. And I think, in the UK at the moment, as I said earlier, that is still possible because we are back on the previous legislation. But in fact, a very kind person at the back there told me that she'd read something this morning that said the NHS is, for example, come out this week and said that these scribes that are used to basically create medical notes, the NHS is saying, actually, those are now medical devices, whereas a lot of people are saying, no, they're not a medical device. So I think everybody and all the regulators are going, we do have to be careful about the amount of software that is in our systems. And, I think the majority of medical devices, if not now, I say to my clients, you've got a small window to be class 1, because very soon, I think, certainly in the EU and the UK, all software is going to be classified as a medical device unless you can really show that it is doing pretty much nothing to do with collating patient data or having some sort of, we've noticed that, this patient who is being monitored at home their heart rate has gone up. I mean, even things like that, which previously people said, well, the doctor then looks at it. They're starting to say now, no, we want to have some oversight on this because it's dealing with patients.
There are various obligations that are required for high-risk systems, but there's also some that apply to both low and high risk. So I'll start with those. it's transparency and, as I mentioned earlier, AI literacy. So this, the transparency point is that all users of AI systems should know that it is an AI system, that the outputs they're receiving are generated by AI. And so that can be done through kind of a user manual beforehand, some sort of watermark on the outputs, even kind of metadata built into the outputs that sticks with the output itself. And so the identification methods themselves need to also be quite robust, because it's quite easy to take watermarks off of things or replace the output into a new document and change it altogether. So they need to be robust. And AI literacy, what I mean by that is that anyone coming into contact with AI systems within a business, whether it's developing them, whether it's simply using AI tools for a business process, needs to be familiar with its limits, how you can mitigate those, its functionality, any security risks, and that needs to be proportionate to the level of the tool itself. As I say, if you're implementing a Gen AI chatbot in your business, the level of AI literacy needs to be different to if you're developing high-risk med devices. So I'm just going to turn to some examples of medical devices, and I'll assess whether they're going to be classified as high risk or not. So this is an example of a well-being tool. So it's a tool that analyzes the diet and exercise information of an individual and provides personalized health tips. Do more steps, eat more fruit. So the categorization of this is that it's going to be unlikely to be a high-risk tool, because it's not serving a medical purpose in the strict regulatory sense, because it also doesn't diagnose or treat any medical conditions in particular. It just supports general wellness. It also doesn't make any medical claims. So again, this is unlikely to be a high-risk tool. The next one, you were just mentioning actually wearable monitoring tools. So this may be subject to change then. But this could be this is a wearable device that may pick up on heart rate changes or sudden falls or any other kind of anomalies. It detects those. Again, unlikely to be a high-risk tool. So it doesn't serve a purely medical purpose. It doesn't provide diagnoses or medical advice. So it's unlikely to trigger the higher risk obligations.
I think the point on that is that if it is just reporting information, for example, to a central, to a hospital from a user, that's not unlikely to be a medical device. If it is analysing that data and providing an alert, then it's creeping more into being classified as a medical device.
And as these tools become more sophisticated, that's when it's going to start straying into that grey area. And I think they'll more likely than not find that they'll be high risk. So moving on to an example of one that is high risk, which, as you say, makes kind of recommendations based on the data. So we've come up with an example of a dermatology tool that uses AI to analyse images and provide a diagnosis of skin conditions for a patient. So this is going to be considered as high risk because the AI system itself is matching images to a bank of kind of database of images that it already has, and is making a recommendation, a medical recommendation on that analysis. And so, as we've said, because it is making that jump from the data to a diagnosis, it is going to be a high-risk system. And then it's going to be subject to all of the additional obligations under the EU AI Act. Because, as I say, it provides medical diagnoses and or at the least would influence clinicians and people looking at the data itself. So now we're going to look at what the actual obligations for high-risk providers are. As I've said and stressed throughout this, they're very strict obligations, and it also requires compliance generally with other union harmonisation legislation, as I said, the MDR. So they already need to be fully compliant with that, and so that includes compliance with safety standards, transparency, other clinical evaluation requirements, and conformity assessments, as we've mentioned. So these are some of the first ones. So providers of high-risk AI systems will need to affix a CE marking on the system once it's complied with conformity standards. It will then need to be registered within the EU database for high-risk systems. This helps keep a check on all of the developed systems in the Union. And these are required steps for market entry and then ongoing oversight from the European Union. As we've said, we feel like we're going over this again, conformity assessments, but this is one that's under the EU AI Act as well. And as Lisa's mentioned, it would be helpful if they could both be done at the same time. So assessments can be performed internally or by third parties, but that's dependent on risk clarification and whether harmonised standards apply. So in the case of medical devices, it's highly, highly likely, almost definitely the case that third-party conformity assessments will be required. And then you'll have the declaration of conformity that needs to be retained by the developer. You then have an entire framework of risk management systems. So this isn't just at the end when you've created the system. This needs to be implemented and designed throughout the whole life cycle, from the initial idea right up to deployment and then ongoing as it's in the market. So this requires identification of known risks, foreseeable risks, and then application of mitigation strategies for those. And then continuous monitoring is incredibly important because these risks can change over time, new risks can impact the system. So continuous monitoring is incredibly important, and then documenting that analysis and retaining that to demonstrate compliance with this is crucial. We've then got data governance. So high-risk systems need data sets that are representative, very high quality, and as devoid of bias as possible. So in our dermatology example, this would ideally be a data set of reference images against peer-reviewed analysis of images that's automatically accepted as industry correct. Any kind of errors within that data set then inject inaccuracy into the system itself. Again, documentation and transparency requirements are incredibly important, and integrity checks throughout. And this is to help ensure that all of the outputs are generally fair, they're not discriminatory, and don't produce any inaccuracies. Technical documentation's incredibly important because the systems are generally quite complex and the risks are very high. And so this needs to detail things like system architecture, how the system's been trained, how it's been tested, and then also document the intended purpose and any limitations of that purpose. It should also include risk management strategies and any oversight practices, and then conformity assessments and life cycle updates can be relied upon throughout to update and resolve any issues that come up. But this should be a kind of support point. Lisa mentioned earlier, automatic operation logging is incredibly important because it logs decisions and outputs that are made by the device. So, for example, again, in the skin detection example, it would log every request and every output of the image from the patient's skin, and this could be analysed and audited at will, which keeps the tool accurate. This needs to be stored securely, and this then allows traceability of issues because it has a complete record of events where anything goes wrong. It's quite easy to see where that's occurred. We've discussed transparency briefly to begin with, and that's an overarching obligation for providers of all AI systems, but these are enhanced obligations for providers of high-risk systems. Again, this requires the provision of quite clear and detailed instructions to the deployers, so those implementing the tools, again, on the capabilities and the limits, what the human oversight procedures are. And this is incredibly important in the medical applications because those that are using the tool need to be able to understand how that fits within their practice. I'm just going to move on now briefly again to another example. So I mentioned earlier biometric analysis. So here's a potential use of an AI system that would monitor facial expressions to analyze emotional responses for mental health purposes. So this is going to be classified as high risk straight off the bat because it does rely on that biometric analysis, and that is listed as automatically a high risk tool. So that's a quite easy one to identify as a high risk system. Human oversight, I have mentioned it earlier, but this is to allow timely and effective human oversight into human intervention to maintain control of a tool. This is throughout the deployment of the process, and this allows humans to interrupt or override. So when things are being used, say for example, the skin diagnosis application, that needs human intervention almost throughout the whole time it's live. So it varies between medical devices, but obviously it's dependent on the risks as well. There needs to be defined oversight roles as well, so it needs to be clear who is actually going to be interrupting, because if there's a delay between working out who has got to actually step in and override, that can introduce additional risks. And then there needs to be clear accountability processes. So the systems obviously must be incredibly accurate and meet certain robustness requirements. This isn't just in relation to the use of the training data, but it's also in respect of cybersecurity as well. So systems need to be designed to withstand cybersecurity threats, because obviously that's a huge risk, and that these safeguards are important to maintain the kind of the trust in the systems themselves. Quality management. So again, this should be implemented to oversee compliance with various standards and procedures that we've mentioned before. But this refers to the kind of structured processes and safeguards that guide how these AI systems operate through the life cycle of from design to deployment. And that involves setting clear objectives, defining specifications, identifying compliance standards, and then testing throughout its life cycle. And this involves continuous improvement as well, and auditing throughout its life cycle beyond deployment. And that's incredibly important for the next point as well, which is the post-market monitoring. So it's not enough to simply develop a tool, deploy it to the market, and wash your hands of it. It needs to have its performance consistently tracked to detect any potential issues as soon as they arise, and then they can develop strategies to resolve them. It's then important to collect feedback and incident reports on the use of these tools, and develop reporting strategies for users of these tools. And then this allows developers to quite quickly resolve any issues. I'll just pass back to Lisa for some points on manufacturers.
Periodic safety update reports and these post-market manufacturing obligations are incredibly important. As I said, we have actually had some new legislation in the UK here under the MDR, under our medical device regulations for periodic safety updates. And in the same way as you have updates for things like serious adverse event reporting within pharma, and for medicines, it's the same thing for these devices. And they are required for devices anywhere from 2A, 2B, and also class 3 devices. So basically, from an MDR perspective, you will have to pretty much have these periodic safety update reports, and I think they come alongside all of this sort of setting up a system and all the things that you need to do to be able to comply with both the MDR and the EU AI Act.
Who do you report to? This will be a national regulatory body in the Union. So in Germany, it's the Federal Network Agency, and in France, it's Directorate General for Competition, Consumer Affairs and Fraud Control. an MDR report into the MHRA. So next steps. Firstly, conduct an AI compliance audit. This is advisable to do ahead of 2027 when the high-risk obligations bite, because it allows you to understand what tools you're either using or developing, and then understand where they fit in the categorisation of risk. Once you've done that, you can then understand what compliance obligations that you have. So once you've identified the compliance obligations, you need to then set up a AI policy that helps you comply with those. This isn't just kind of like small deployment processes, how users interact them. It also requires record-keeping processes, things like that. You then need to implement training programs and guidance. So this goes back to the AI literacy point that I mentioned earlier, that everyone in your organization should have an appropriate level of AI literacy to the tools that they're using. And once you've done that, again, keep records of the training and the strategies. So this is incredibly important to document ongoing compliance with your obligations under the EU AI Act, because the disclosure requirements under the Act are quite significant. So having records of training and other policies is really useful.
What I wanted to do, and it's interesting that Tom just finished on a policy point of view. I think you'll see if you are wanting to deploy any kind of AI as a medical device in the EU, there's a huge amount of work to pull together. And I wanted to just sort of mention this point because it is an important thing under the AI Act. And it is also something that's very important that I've seen more and more recently with basically AI developers talking about, right, I've got this incredible algorithm, you know, how do I protect my AI system? As we all know, certainly in Europe and certainly in the UK, actually getting anything like patent protection for any kind of software is incredibly difficult. So perhaps people, and I certainly from experience, people are now turning to trade secrets. So what can you do if you've got AI, an AI medical device, and you want to deploy it and you want to have a trade secret? You want to keep part of it as a trade secret. And I think what was interesting when I first started looking at this, I thought, oh God, the AI Act is going to basically say you've got it's transparency and they're not even going to mention trade secrets. Thankfully, the EU AI Act does actually mention trade secrets, and it does talk about the commercial benefit of trade secrets. So this always has to be balanced against the need for transparency and explainability of your AI system. But there is the possibility of, and I always say to people, if you're talking about a trade secret, don't tell me that your entire program is a trade secret, because it isn't. You need to be very specific in terms of identifying what part of your system, what part is the bit that codes for the algorithm. What's the really clever bit? That is the bit that can be a trade secret. And if you want to basically protect that as a trade secret on that policy point, you've got to put not just a trade secret policy in place, but you've got to put in additional mechanisms to make sure that you can argue for, you know, to be compliant with various trade secret regulations across the world, that actually you've dealt with this as a trade secret, which gives you that additional protection for your very valuable AI as a medical device. And you can still be compliant with EU AI Act. It's going to be a bit tricky, because you do have to worry about explainability and transparency. But our view at the moment is that it can be done with some very careful drafting of trade secret policies and implementation of various rules to make sure that the AI is protected. I think you'll see there's a huge mountain to climb in terms of basically getting these AI systems as medical devices implemented and available on the market.